Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
It's an honor today to have Dr. Walter Greenleaf visiting us at Microsoft Research. Walter Greenleaf got his PhD in the area of neuro and biobehavioral sciences at Stanford University. Well, actually, I met him years ago, and Jaron as well has known him for many years. His current research focuses on product development efforts with the use of simulation technology to improve neurological, cognitive, and physical rehabilitation. He's, over the years, jumped from academic scholarship into the world of startups in this space. He's currently the founder of In-World Solutions, a company that actually specializes in using immersive technologies, augmented reality, virtual worlds for behavioral healthcare. He's also CEO for Virtually Better, a company that develops virtual environments for the treatment of phobias, anxiety disorders, PTSD, and even treating addictions. He's a pioneer in an area that was called, a subfield called virtual reality in medicine or healthcare. Lots of technologies and ideas that came out of that, and even a conference or a set of workshops. He's currently also a scientific advisor and proposal reviewer for the U.S. Public Health Service, the NIH, NASA, and
Stop.
Okay, well, lots of advisory roles, and he's been in the media, and he's communicating about the possibilities here for a long time. Walter, go for it.
Okay. Thanks, Eric. The minutia is too much. Well, I'm really excited to be here, and one of the reasons I'm excited to be here is that I think Microsoft is in a position, because of some of the technology you guys are promulgating, to really make a difference in healthcare and in the part of healthcare that I've been working so hard on. And it's an important area. It's sort of a part of medicine that's been a little bit by the wayside. Occupational therapy, physical therapy, psychiatry, psychology, they've all been under-technologized over the years for many reasons, which I won't go into here. But with the Xbox, with the Kinect System, with some of the virtual world technology you guys are pioneering, it's really making a big difference in my field. And I'll go into detail about that. But I do have a favor to ask of my audience. There's a substantial amount of material that's interesting to cover, and there's also enough time to cover it. But it's going to be a little drab and boring if it's just me giving a spiel. So I'm going to say some things, but I want you guys to participate too, give me some questions, object fiercely, criticize, comment, expand upon, so that our audience isn't just listening to me give a spiel. Okay, let's start. Here are the 4 main points I'm going to try and cover. That it's not just, what I'm going to talk about isn't something that just recently sprung out of a clamshell. It's something that's been founded on more than 25 years worth of foundational research. And I'll talk about some of the data, the fMRI studies, the longitudinal and latitudinal studies that have been done. But there is a foundation of research. I also want to talk about why it's an inflection point right now. The changes in technology and the changes of cost, more importantly, is making this available to people both domestically and worldwide. It's part of the breakthroughs that are going on in telemedicine. I'll give some examples of how virtual environments are being used for a whole variety of things, not just in behavioral medicine, but in physical medicine and as a disability solution. And then I'll talk about some of the things that are just right around the corner, some of which are being pioneered here at Microsoft Research. Actually, a number of the things, I give this spiel to other people, and probably at least 5 out of the 7 of the things I'm talking about that are just around the corner are being pioneered here at Microsoft Research. Okay, well, as you guys know, virtual environments have been around for a while, and they're predicated upon some foundational technology that came out of research labs more than 30 years ago, with general purpose simulators being a recent invention. It used to be a sort of a primary focus of virtual environments to be focused on one specific thing, like a flight simulator. But this gentleman here, Jaron, was one of the first guys to promulgate the idea of having a general purpose simulation. Now this was back in the days of computers being, to do a simulation being $400,000, $500,000 on a silicon graphics machine. And Jaron, I think one of the first times I think you elucidated the idea of using a virtual environment to do programming was in this article from Scientific American with the data glove, using to do coding. But this concept of having a general purpose simulation was very important, and it sprung a number of people, such as myself, getting involved. And for me, it's been sort of an exciting journey. Here's a picture of me back when I was in my late 20s, I guess, and when I started on this endeavor to get involved in using virtual environments. What excited me was the idea of using synthetic environments for stroke rehabilitation. I'd known a number of people who'd had family members who enjoyed or suffered from a stroke, and I really thought the virtual environments would be a fantastic way for us to be able to help manage the rehabilitation process. And finally, with the advent of the technologies that's present now, we're seeing this technology coming out and being used not just in the laboratory. The technology is escaping the laboratory and make it into clinical care. Of course, in medicine, one of the areas where virtual environments have made a substantial difference and are starting to become part of the standard of care is in 3D visualization, perioperative planning, and data fusion in the middle of a surgical procedure where a CAT scan or MRI image may be reviewed and used to plan a surgical operation and then overlaid upon the operating field to help guide someone. It's also used for training, so surgeons can learn to use the dexterous movements of new tools to be able to do a complex procedure. And also now we're starting to see sort of a separation between the end effector with the human and the surgical tool with robotic-assisted surgery like the Da Vinci system. Some people argue that there's a hype cycle that goes on with emerging technologies, and they would suggest that virtual reality is right through the trough of disillusionment and is starting to come out on the other edge where there's what is called the scope of enlightenment and plateau of productivity. I'm not sure where virtual reality really falls on this, but there sure were a lot of really bad movies back in the early 90s about virtual environments.
All right, so right now cloud computing is the most overhyped thing?
That's what these people who've made this graph would, I guess it's the Gartner group. Well, yeah, and e-book readers. You know, this is all. And augmented reality is on the advancing slope to being overhyped.
I see.
My point is,
It's amazing how, if that's a 2009 picture, how much that picture has to change from 2011, even if you believe the shape of these things.
right.
What you put on, you dangle on that graph are all different now.
I mean, tablets would seem to be mainstream at this point, not due to us, unfortunately. And it's interesting. It's a cool slide. Oh, Gartner, huh?
Yeah.
Amazing. All right.
I was 2 years old now, so everything.
Yeah.
You know, let's for the sake of discussion, white out all the specific text here.
Yes.
And just say that at some point, virtual environments are on this curve, and I would like to think that the phrase is no longer, just like artificial intelligence at one point was a sort of an overhyped phrase. I think the phrase is now a useful phrase, and when I talk to clinicians about using a virtual environment as part of a therapeutic process, they no longer, look at me as if I'm crazy. And there's we'll go into this later, but there's several international societies of cyber psychology and Society for International Virtual Rehabilitation. There's a lot of clinical journals and research groups. So the phrase has made the transition from being sort of an overhyped phrase, an overhyped concept. It spawned a number of lousy movies and a few bad television shows. But now it's on the other side, and we're starting to see it as part of the tools that we use for clinical care. Right now, some of the virtual environments that are out there are incredibly realistic, but they're missing something very important. I'll go into that. They can be very photorealistic with real-world physics and adequate sensory immersion. But one of the pioneering things that Microsoft Research is part of right now is the avatars don't often have the right non-verbal behavior, facial expressions, body language, and movements. And in order to seem real, the avatar, you guys have seen this in Second Life, I'm sure, where everybody's sort of walking around like this and they have pretty blank expressions. For my purposes, for the use of in clinical care, we need to have more natural body language, natural facial expressions. So even though there's been great breakthroughs in VoIP and better graphics processors, broadband, movement tracking, low-cost computers, all this has really helped advance the field, but some of the late-breaking things that are just coming out now that are incredibly important is the use of nonverbal behaviors and gestures as part of the experience. Okay, again, to move along, there's been a foundation of more than 25 years of clinical research, but just now this technology is escaping the lab and making it into the clinical area. Okay, let me talk a little bit from a neuroscience perspective. In order to change a behavior, you really need to change your brain. And this is often you'll hear people talking about years of therapy. And it can take years because right now, previously we really haven't had the tools to break down that change into small finite steps. Also, repetition is required and repetition can be boring. It's also important to involve the brain's reward systems with positive feedback in order to engender the change. And that's one of the things that's been lacking in both behavioral therapy and also in physical therapy and occupational therapy, getting that feedback loop and closing it with a reward system, breaking things down into small steps. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is going to involve how do we engage the human cognitively to participate in their own change and rehabilitation in a way that's not boring, that activates the reward systems, and allows someone to do something that's repetitive, but with a little bit of change, and an ability to monitor progress and get feedback. And I'll show you how we do that. It's really critical to engage the brain's reward systems. And here's a book I just found out about. I haven't read it yet, but I'd like the title, The Compass of Pleasure, How Our Brains Make Fatty Foods, Orgasm, Exercise, Drugs, Generosity, which is a social experience, alcohol, learning, gambling, feel so good. These are the sort of things that in a gaming environment we can leverage the brain's reward systems to motivate us to change how our brains work. And that's sort of the basic principle of using a virtual environment in a therapeutic manner, is to harnessing the brain's systems and the reward systems in particular to help engender change. Okay, here are some examples. I'm going to start first with behavioral health, but later I'll talk about physical medicine. Here are some specific examples of how virtual environments are being used clinically right now in behavioral medicine. We treat phobia and anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress, developmental disabilities such as autism and Asperger's, conduct disorders, drug and alcohol abuse, anger, eating, impulsive disorders. The list goes on, and I'll show you how we do it. Let's skip a little bit here. Here's just a few quick clips of some of the virtual environments that we're using therapeutically right now. You'll notice that there's a whole variety of graphical resolution. There's no coherent platform right now and no standards for the virtual environments that are used in behavioral environment. It's sort of all over the map. And some are very cartoony, some are very photorealistic, but it seems to us, the researchers in this field, that the degree of realism per se, the graphical realism, isn't as important as the cognitive engagement. And I'll go into what's involved with that. So the examples here, there's a virtual liquor store that we use of helping people with problems with alcohol and substance abuse get familiar with what otherwise might trigger a craving and learn to master the response to that craving. I'll show you examples of how we use that in a social environment. Here's a World Trade Center virtual environment that's used to help the still large number of people that are suffering from post-traumatic stress from living near the World Trade Center or watching it on TV. There's quite it's a large number of people that are still suffering from the cognitive problem of that, but they can, years later, you can still get help and make improvements. Actually, I recently talked to someone who was a Vietnam vet who had been suffering from post-traumatic stress for, I guess, more than 40 years now. recently he went into a center that used a virtual Vietnam to help him overcome his post-traumatic stress. And despite years of therapy previously, it was being able to use that virtual environment that helped him overcome his post-traumatic stress. And I'll go into the details about how that's done. There's another example here of using a virtual environment for what we call stress inoculation. The Center for Disease Control is using virtual environments to help prepare their first responders to disease outbreaks so that when they go to, if they've ever been camping before and all at once they're off in an African village and learning to deal with the jungle, you can prepare them cognitively so that they don't have a stress reaction. Another example is using a virtual environment to help with fear of flying. For fear of public speaking, we can use a virtual environment to reinforce. It's amazing how well this works. To have an audience that actually smiles and claps when you're speaking, gives you positive reinforcement, can help you overcome any so this is your cue, audience. So the point is, we can use virtual environment to change how you respond to a specific situation that otherwise might be very stressful. And again, we use a virtual environment to help with the social cues that you need to master if you're having a substance or addiction issue like nicotine or alcohol or other addictive substances. In some cases, we use actual green-screened individuals to put into as the avatars, mostly because we need the micro-expressions on facial expression to do this. But in other cases, we just use very graphic avatars. And I'll show you the distinction of why we do that. Okay, so that's sort of my smorgasbord in behavioral medicine of some of the areas.
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
In the previous slide, what was the application of the people around the pizza boxes?
That's for
The
people.
other ones I get, Vietnam, public speaking, fear of flying. What's that one?
That one is for, it's a party scene, and a clinician might use it for someone who's having trouble walking into a party, being offered a cigarette.
Social phobia.
Social phobia, it can also be used if you're nicotine issues,
okay.
alcohol issues. Often what people will happen to people is that they're very good at maybe at home not reaching for a cigarette or reaching for a beer, but they'll go out to a social scene, and the sensory clues, the social clues will trigger the behavior they're trying to avoid. So what the clinician will do is they'll have the person practice going to a party, and it works. You might not think it does, but it really does. You go to a virtual environment, you practice saying no to the beer that's offered to you. You do that over and over and over again. Eventually, you get it down. Why can't you just do that using your imagination in the clinician's office where you're sitting and they say, okay, imagine you're going into a bar and somebody's offering you a beer. What are you going to do? You might think, okay, I'm not going to do it. Again, unless we engage the brains, the more sensory systems we can evolve, the better response we get. And it can make the difference between years of therapy, years of counseling, versus just a few sessions. And to that effort, we do have some olfactory stimulation systems that seem to really help a lot for some of the things that we're doing. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second because I've given 10 minutes worth of a spiel here, and just say, what do you guys think so far? Is this lining up for you? Any questions at this point? Okay, all right. Let's push on then. All right, I break down what's going on right now in therapeutic healthcare with virtual environments into sort of 4 zones. There's the very immersive virtual environments where you use a HMD. You may have tactile and olfactory stimulation that goes on hand in hand with that. These are typically used for the post-traumatic stress, the phobias, and the anxiety disorders. Another zone is the interactive social virtual environments. These can be done with a flat screen. They can be done over a network, but they emphasize the social interaction between individuals. And this is where we need to have the facial expressions and the body language, etc., in order to have it work. These environments are used for addictions, for learning social skills, dealing with problems such as autism and Asperger's, anger management, impulsive disorders, attention disorders like ADHD. The next zone are the sort of zones where games for health, for wellness and prevention, where you're trying to learn better eating habits, better exercise habits, smoking cessation, etc. These often are done on the flat screen, game-like environments as we described, But they have a completely different paradigm. The clinician's not involved. These are often things that can be done on your own with the help of autonomous coach or an algorithm to help you manage your progress through the therapeutic procedure. And the final area is mostly dichotomized because it uses other sensors. And this is the zone of physical rehabilitation and injury recovery for stroke, traumatic brain injury, etc. Have you guys ever, has anybody in this room ever gone through physical therapy from an injury? Okay, it's really boring, isn't it? You have to have the personality of an athlete to do it. And one of the things that's coming through right now is we're using these virtual environments to make it both social. You can do your rehabilitation over a network with other people and see your progress and make it engaging. So no longer does it have to be something where it's painful and boring. It can be painful and interesting. Okay. All right, let me show you some examples of the immersive treatments that we're doing for post-traumatic stress, etc. I should mention that our collaborators, which I think folks here at Microsoft Research are probably doing some work with, Mark Bullis at IC2 is doing a lot of work in this area, and Skip Rizzo is one of the early promulgators of using virtual environments for a variety of problems, such as post-traumatic stress and for cognitive rehabilitation. So I'll go into detail a little bit on this one. There's a huge number of, unfortunately, servicemen and women coming back from extended tours of duty in combat zones. And they may have a traumatic experience that's acute, where they're driving in a Humvee and there's an explosion and they see something very, very disturbing, like a friend being killed. But there's also just the chronic stress of being in a war zone, constantly worrying about what's going to happen, being hyper-vigilant for years. And this results in long-term disabilities. And I'll give other examples from like earthquake, post-traumatic stress, etc. But we'll use combat as an example here. So a consequence might be you come back, you're no longer enlisted in the military, you're driving on I-405, yet you see some trash on the side of the road and it causes a panic response. Or you go under a bridge and you're worried somebody's going to drop a grenade down from you. It's very hard to unlearn this learned fear response. And it can haunt you for years. The example I gave earlier of someone from Vietnam suffering from problems 40 years later. Yet, there's a way to treat it. You use, basically you've learned a limbic system fear response that is triggered by visual and auditory and olfactory stimuli. And it's a survival response in the mammal to have that sort of instinctual reaction to something that almost killed you before. To unlearn it, you need to have to go back, stimulate those parts of the brain that have learned that response, yet do it in a controlled way so that what we call our higher functions start kicking in and saying, oh, that piece of trash on the side of the road, I know what that is. I'm no longer back in a war zone. It's just trash. It's very hard to do that if you're just using your imagination. Your brain, those are painful memories, painful images. And besides, not all of us are very good at reimagining things anyhow. Only a handful of people can really have the vivid visual and olfactory and auditory memories anyhow. And your brain doesn't want to go there if you've had trauma over it. We can take people there in a graduated manner, do the exposure and immersion, cognitive immersion, to habituate that fear response. And it works. So here are some clips of a system being used. Currently, we've recently deployed in 10 Air Force bases, and I think we've got probably 30 systems out at VA hospitals right now. It's a great success story of where a clinician will work with a patient. They use an HMD, and they go through, and I'll show you some video clips of this. They go through in a graduated manner. You might start with something that's non-traumatic at first and just get them used to the system. Returning to the scene of the stress. And the counselor helps them manage their anxiety. They practice breathing and relaxation techniques. And after it may not take several sessions, it may take 10 sessions, but after a while, the brain gradually habituates and you can recover from the post-traumatic stress. And again, the same paradigm can map to fear of flying, fear of heights, early trauma, childhood abuse, etc. There's lots of stressors out there that cause problems for people later in life. And the same paradigm can be used to help them overcome them. Jaron?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so let me show you a clip on how we do it. This is from an Xbox game, actually. So this is from Skip Rizzo's virtual environment. And a clinician might just start out with this or a more neutral scene where they're just driving along in a Humvee, but nothing necessarily traumatic happens other than just being re-exposed to the scenes of war.
The principle here is exposure with some notion of relaxation or distancing from maybe the negative affect again and again and again through some repetitive trial is a healthy thing to do to get beyond some sort of a fear that came from a single incident or a scary incident. Is that the principle?
Yeah, you're trying to reassociate those sights and sounds and smells with a more relaxed situation. And you're trying to let people know that they can think about these things, be exposed to them, and not have a panic response. So in a way, you could just simply describe it as habituation. It's called exposure therapy.
So as you expose, how are you relaxing?
Well, the clinician...
This is not exactly a relaxing spa process.
Right. Well, the clinician is there with you in the room. You know it's not real. At any point, you can take off the HMD. The clinician is instructing you to relax, to remember that it's not real. The clinician is having you practice breathing. If they see you're getting a little bit overstressed, they'll say, why don't we stop for a moment and think about this? And it works. Now, the biggest problem we have is actually having people volunteering to be part of this. This is something they're very fearful of. And unfortunately, in the military, too, there's a huge stigma about post-traumatic stress. It's getting better, but my understanding from talking to clinicians is once they get someone to say, you know, I have symptoms of post-traumatic stress, I'm having suicidal thoughts, I'm having a lot of stress and anxiety, there are processes like this that can put them through that help get them back. But because they might lose their job, because it's not macho to admit that you're having this, it's hard to get people to participate. And that brings up another point I want to make, which is one of the advantages of using avatar-based therapy is that we can do anonymous counseling and anonymous help. So maybe help people start taking those first few steps where they don't actually have to go to the clinic, where they could show up as a virtual avatar. And it's not just for post-traumatic stress. If you have a sexual addiction, if you have a drug or alcohol or substance abuse problem, you might want to show up for your sessions to start the process as an anonymous avatar. And I'll go into that a little bit later. But go ahead, Jaron.
I was just going to mention, when these applications of treating PTSD with virtual reality first were proposed, I was one of the biggest skeptics. And I thought it was just too cute and gimmicky, and what persuaded me about it was really just the clinical results. So it was one of those things where I really came to it with a bias, feeling that this couldn't possibly be for real, and it turned out to be. So I was actually chastened by it.
Well, I'll show you some of the data if we have time. But it actually it's pretty amazing. You can see a nice stepwise improvement that you don't see when you look at wait-listed controls or if you look at other ways of doing it. Now, I should point out, for some of these things, like fear of flying, exposure therapy has been done for years, but they would actually have to take someone to the airport. Like, or for fear of heights, they have to take them to a bridge or the elevator, and they would have to go with them. Very expensive, very time-consuming. And for a combat or an earthquake type of post-traumatic stress, it's very hard to take someone to re-experience that in a controlled manner. So the virtual environments give us the ability to do something cost-effectively, possibly over the internet, and in a controlled manner with measurable data. And that's one of the keys of some of these things I'm going to be talking about too, is not only are we getting new tools for therapy, we're getting new tools for monitoring and measuring progress. And one of the reasons cognitive behavioral therapy, physical therapy, and occupational therapy have been sort of under-technologized aspects of medicine is that they haven't had good measurement tools. So one of the ultra messages I'd like to convey here is that this is going to, the technology that's being worked on here and other places is going to bring out a new ability to measure and index progress in a part of medicine that's largely been analog and subjective. These virtual environments can be used to measure objectively things that so far have been subjective. But that's for another part of the talk. I'm going to push on because I have a lot to go over and not a lot of time. So anyhow, just very quickly, research has shown that it's more effective than just plain imaginable exposure. It's as effective as the in vivo exposure, and of course more cost effective. You don't have to have an exact replica of the environment to have a therapeutic effect. You just need to have enough cues to stimulate that sort of anxiety response. But it doesn't supplant the clinician. It's just a tool that allows them to do things that otherwise are too difficult or impossible to do. Let's see here. Well, I'm going to skip ahead to some of the work on fear of flying. This is an area where there's been a lot of research showing the clinical mechanism and validating it. And of course now we're starting to have much more high resolution airports that we can take people to for putting them through. Here's an example of one of the studies on fear of flying. On the left hand of the graph you see virtual reality exposure therapy, both pre-treatment. There's an index of fear of flying. It's a general scale. The post 6 sessions of treatment and then a 6-month follow-up. So with the virtual reality exposure, you see a nice stepwise decline. Same comparable to the standard exposure. But with the wait-listed control, they don't get better over time, they actually get worse. And this is a typical pattern we see for other areas where there's been research. Here's a study on virtual RAC that's been done at Camp Pendleton with the Marines that are coming back. Same type of progress, that pre-treatment high levels of measurements of post-traumatic stress, including indexes of anxiety and depression. Post-treatment, there's a decrease, and then with the 3-month follow-up, there's even more of a decrease. And it shows up not just in the overt symptoms of post-traumatic stress, but other measurements of anxiety and depression. We've looked at where is this going on in the brain, looking at an area of interest with fMRI that map to neuroplastic changes, and we can track the changes that go on looking at amygdala activation pre and post treatment of using this approach. So this is not just a subjective index of improvement that we're getting from self-report of the patients going through, but we see objective measurable changes in the brain correlating with the improvement. And there's been a number of meta-analyses that have looked at the value of this for treating exposure therapy. I should mention, though, that despite the clinical validation studies that have been done, and despite the almost now 20 years worth of research in the laboratories on this, it's just now making the transition from the university laboratory to clinical care. And there's been barriers to entry on a market basis, a lot of which has been cost. And again, that's one of the reasons I'm really excited to be talking to this group, is that the Xbox, the Kinect, some of the other technologies that you guys are pioneering are making this affordable, and that will make the difference. If it's just an expensive way of having a therapeutic approach, the clinicians won't be able to take the time or afford to do it. But making it affordable makes all the difference. Okay, let's talk about just general cognitive. I was talking about one specific vertical area, post-traumatic stress, but let's talk about general cognitive behavioral therapy. I won't ask how many people in the audience have had to go through counseling or psychiatric or psychological care, but I will point out that for most people, it's a long, drawn-out process with often very low yield. I'm sure the clinicians out there will probably take issue with it, but it takes time and doesn't always work. And part of it is, in my opinion, is that You have to recall past events. You have to convey them verbally to the clinician you're working with. You have to do some role-playing and imaginative work on how you're going to handle the situation. Maybe you're dealing with getting into a fight with your spouse all the time, or maybe you're dealing with an anger issue you have, or maybe you're dealing with an addiction that you have. It's very hard to just talk about these things. But if we use the virtual environment as scaffolding for these discussions, it can make a big difference. And I'll show you how we use it. Again, what goes on just with talk therapy, it's very hard to change the neural system behind the behavior because you're not activating enough parts of the brain. At least that's my biased perspective on it. I feel that in order to change the brain system, you have to activate it. And if you're just using talk therapy alone, you're not engaging the patient, activating enough parts of the brain to do it. So what we're using right now, interactive virtual environments in a variety of situations. I'll show you a few examples. But in this case, now we're stepping away from using the fully immersive with 3D audio and 3D visual and sometimes olfactory stimulus to just using a standard keyboard and visual display. Despite the less immersion, we're finding that it works very well, especially with younger patients. For example, we're using it right now at a clinic in Newark, New Jersey with kids who are 14, 15 years old, both girls and boys, who are in a locked residential care facility because of their behavioral problems, conduct disorders, violence. These are kids that are there because people believe that they don't have to spend the rest of their life in prison. But unless they learn how to control their impulses, these are kids who've killed other kids or other people, and these are kids who have burned down buildings, and I won't go into the list, but there's hope. And we're using the virtual environments, and the clinicians tell me it's working, for them to learn to control their impulses and modify their behavior. So in this case, we use a 3D interactive virtual environment to do role-playing and interaction. So the clinician may take on the role of another teen, and they may discuss or do some role-playing of how to deal with a very frustrating situation. And they'll practice how to respond to it. Now, the clinicians tell me, if they just sit down with the kid and try and do some role-playing in two chairs, sitting and talking, these kids won't stand for it. They'll pick up a chair and they'll throw it across the room. They won't pay attention. They get maybe 5 minutes at most of engagement of these kids. But they'll sit down and they'll spend an hour in the virtual environment. Part of it probably is that they're a little bit more anonymous. Part of it is they don't have to worry about what their body is doing. Part of it is that the clinician is no longer the man, an older adult. He's taking the role of a teenager. And so we've had great progress in having these kids learn to control their impulses. And that's just one example. I'll give you some examples further downstream in my talk about how it's being used for kids with autism and Asperger's to learn social skills. But these flat screen interactive virtual environments have proven to be some breakthrough ways of helping reach people with cognitive behavioral problems that otherwise can't be reached through therapy. Okay. The other advantage of using a virtual environment for cognitive behavioral therapy and other forms of rehabilitation is you can create a community. Often the therapy is in isolation, but if you're doing family therapy, if you're doing things that involve, for example, a serviceman or woman coming back with an amputation, what we're doing right now is we're working with the Air Force to help people who are deployed stay in touch with their families through a virtual environment where it's not just video conferencing, where you're doing, postage stamp look at someone else and you're talking with them. If you have a 5-year-old kid, this video conferencing only works for a few minutes. They want to do something with you. In a virtual environment, you can go for a ride, you can go for a walk, you can go play a game, or you can go for a scavenger hunt. Then later, if there's an injury and dad's returning and he's making his progress through the healthcare system before he's coming back, a clinician can meet with the kids in the family and say, look, mom's coming back, dad's coming back, he's going to be a little bit different, he had a brain injury or he lost an arm. Prepare them psychologically and also prepare the servicemen and women what it's going to be like to be, so we can build a community and we can help people make transitions through the use of a virtual environment. I'm going to pause for a second because I've been talking uninterrupted for a while. What do you guys think so far? Any questions?
One question I have is in counseling, have people thought about, I would be curious about various studies that degrade the fidelity in characteristic ways and seeing what you lose or gain as you do that, potentially lose mostly. Like, for example, if you go down from an interactive flat screen representation of isometric views into a 3D world, and you go to beautifully rendered sets of pages of scenes, how much does that get you to turn on the visual system and
Right.
immerse you in a Norman Rockwell scene of a homecoming for a serviceman?
Right.
You know, there must be some effect to that kind of thing as well.
Well, I'll tell you a couple of thoughts. I think there have been some studies, mostly looking at the difference between HMDs with 3D sound versus flat screen. But, you know, the need's been so acute and the funding has been so minuscule that there really hasn't been a lot of research in this area. I can tell you some of the clinical impressions I get from people who use the virtual environments. For the anxiety disorders like the phobias, post-traumatic stress, a little bit of a clue goes a long way. People's brains take them there if they just get a few little stimulus. So it doesn't matter how high resolution it is. For the adults, I mean older adults, let's say, who are using virtual environments, they haven't spent a lot of time playing video games, at least not most of them. So it takes them a little while to get familiar with it, but there the fidelity doesn't make a big difference. But for some of the teenagers that we're working with, if you put them in a bogus virtual environment that is just like lame, like just 2 years ago old technology, they don't want to participate because it's old. So I think in a way you're asking two questions, Eric. One is what's the level of fidelity we need to get a clinical effect? And two is sort of the social context for doing this. You know, what's going to make someone want to participate and comply with participating in it?
I was largely asking the former.
Yeah. And
I'm not sure whether to ask this or bring it up, but it seems kind of scary thinking if there's a positive therapeutic effect of this, what about the opposite side? What about the immersion warfare that
Right.
modern teenagers
Yeah.
exposed to?
It's an important question, and I'm glad you brought it up. For years, some of the video game people have been saying, these games that have you stabbing and shooting and blowing up things all day long, and some kids will spend 12 hours a day doing this. Doesn't transfer over. That you don't learn from it. But now that we're starting to have some healthy games come out and using these virtual environments, some of the video game companies are saying, it can transfer over in some contexts. And you're absolutely right. I think that we do reprogram our brains all the time by how we spend our time and what the context is. And I would like to see that kept in mind as games are designed. I think that would be important. My role is to try and leverage all this gaming technology and all this military simulation technology and move it over for therapeutic purposes. But if you're asking me, do I think some negative things can happen because of being immersed in violent video games? Sure. Yes, it does happen. Yes?
Do you see a future for Xbox's new conferencing app called, I think it's called Avatar, playing in this
Avatar
space?
Kinect.
You don't have to worry about the uncanny valley because they're all avatars.
Right. Actually, I've got that a little bit further down in the spiel here. But yeah, it's going to make a big difference in what we do.
Especially if there's physical attributes to the therapy and may join in groups that might seem like it would help quite a bit.
Absolutely. For group therapy, for networked therapy, sometimes having an anonymous presence, especially I'm finding for the work groups that we do for kids with autism and Asperger's who are learning social skills, somehow not having to worry about what your body's doing, somehow not having to make eye contact, that puts, and also having control of the world, the degree of complexity, allows the clinician or counselor who's working with them to staircase them up into learning some social skills that otherwise that might not be able to do. There's some really great things we can do with the technology that you just described. For example, part of the misdevelopment in the social brain that often happens with autism and Asperger's is the ability to recognize correctly facial expressions and other nonverbal clues such as body language and gestures. We can exaggerate those in a virtual environment and have someone practice recognizing them until they get it. And then we can reduce the exaggeration until they recognize it with normal level of realism. So we can finally take social interaction and adjust the degree of fidelity for therapeutic purposes. And it's really going to make a big difference. And the ability to measure movement, well, that has great implications not just for the therapeutic aspects in behavior, but also for stroke rehabilitation, traumatic brain injury rehabilitation, etc. I'll get to that in a moment too. Okay, all right. Let's keep moving unless there's any other questions right now. Okay. Usually at this point, I would invite my colleague Ivana Steigman, who's out there doing a lot of clinical care and research right now, to join us. This is but she's not available right now. But this is the user interface we've developed for using one virtual environment for online interactive therapy. The avatars are pretty good. If she was moving around and talking with us and giving a tour right now, you'd see that she has natural, the biokinetics and movement is pretty natural. There's great facial expressions which are linked to the tone of her voice. There's lip syncing. So when she talks, her lips move, and the facial expression maps some aspects of the tone of her voice. And we have buttons the clinician can use to not just give certain gestures, but to convey emotions. There's another set of gestures that we can pull up for different emotions like happiness, sadness, etc. So Ivana uses this as a therapeutic environment, either co-located, where she's sitting on one computer and the person she's working with is sitting at another, or for group therapy, where they're all sitting together on computers in one room but meeting in the same virtual environment, or distributed across a distance. An example is a group of social skill work for kids with Asperger's, where they'll meet Wednesday night at the clinic, and they'll all participate in the virtual environment at the clinic. But then on Thursday night and Friday night, they meet from their homes and practice the social skills they've learned in a moderated group environment. Part of the problem we have with this virtual environment right now is exactly what I described, that we use a button to say happiness, a button to say anger. So we convey the emotions to the avatars here in a very binary manner without very much finesse. So one of the things I'm very excited about with the Kinect technology is the ability to map facial expressions to our avatars. I can't wait till we can do that. We don't have it in a clinical environment yet, but you've created the underlying technology for that. So this is the virtual environment we're using right now for substance abuse issues, for social skills training, for anger management, for addressing issues of family therapy, a whole variety. And I'll show you some examples of that. Here's an example of using this for family therapy, teaching somebody in a group therapy situation how to deal with a family issue. Here's an example of, okay.
Okay, Val, are you ready to role play? I'll play your mother and you can just be yourself. Ready?
I think so.
Okay, let's all teleport to the house while I change my avatar to look more like DeBal's mother.
The wallpaper's horrible in this example.
So, son, what did you want to talk about?
I'm not really sure, but I know that I've let you and Dad down and become a great disappointment.
One advantage of doing some of the role playing in a virtual environment is you can capture the interaction and then review it for sort of a debriefing. So that was an example of how they might have done some role playings of what the son's going to do to talk to her mom about a difficult subject. But later, after doing the role playing, you can save it on a smartphone or on some other pad-like device to review and practice. If you're dealing with how to deal with a bully at school, or if you're dealing how to deal with a difficult coworker, you can do some role playing and then review it later. I'll give some examples of some social skills work too. Oops.
Okay, thank you all for teleporting to the school.
Oh, this is from some role playing we did with the social skills group with kids with autism.
Just inviting our friends to the movie. phase. Remember how we were learning earlier this morning in our circle about how to start and maintain a conversation and how to end a conversation. So I would like to know who would like to volunteer to practice those skills. I would. I will. Okay, how about we have LaToya and Linda? If you guys would all mind, the rest of the kids, if you would circle around and let them be the center so they can practice their skills. And please remember that, as we're practicing here, that, we're going to give feedback to you, but this is only to help you and not to hurt or make fun of anybody. So I just want you to know that we're all here to support you, okay? Okay. All right, go ahead. Let's start a conversation. Hey, what's up? How about their body space? Now, remember we talked about body space.
Okay, you get the idea. Go ahead, Eric.
In that situation, are people interacting live, or if so, what are the controls they have to move their avatar around?
What was that user interface I showed you earlier? The moving the avatars is by mouse and keyboard movement, and that's why it looks sort of jerky.
So they get trained in navigation in this space, basically.
Yeah, well, for kids, you don't even have to tell them. I mean, they sit down and they know that the W and the S and the key are for certain movements, and old school. And so in that case, it was that paradigm I described to you before, where they're all meeting at a clinic. They all have their own computer, and they're meeting in the virtual environment. And then later, they can meet offline from their home to practice with a moderated sort of chat room way of practicing the social skills.
What software platform are these examples running on?
That was from Olive.
This is Olive, okay.
Yeah. And stands for Online Interactive Virtual Environment. It's Forterra out of San Mateo developed it. Was recently acquired by SAIC. We use it because it's HIPAA compliant, which is very important for what we're doing. These become medical records, which is another whole issue of discussion we should talk about. But it's important to be able to, keep the medical record confidential, and the voice is identifying for an individual. One could argue also that the body language, once we start mapping that, and the facial expressions, that's going to become uniquely identifiable too. So you have to treat these as medical records. Even if they're an anonymous avatar, if you're capturing the person's behavior, you're making a medical record. So it's something to keep in mind.
Very interesting,
Okay, well, here's just one other quick example. I want to push on some other things. This is like using this for an anonymous AA meeting. Oop, let me go back here.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Friday Morning San Jose group. My name is Barry. I'm an alcoholic and chair of this group.
Good morning,
Hi, Barry. Hi, Barry.
Good morning, Barry. Good morning, everyone. The purpose of this meeting is to share our experience, strength, and hope with each other so we can solve our common problems with alcohol and addiction. Let's go around the room and introduce yourself by your...
So it takes on the format of a standard clinical therapeutic environment. Doesn't have to be the usual AA structure, but allows people to A, participate in a telemedicine manner, and that's really important to keep costs down. B, for people who might be shy about talking about a psychological problem, it breaks that barrier. They can show up as an anonymous avatar and get help. So it's going to open up therapy to people who otherwise would, for cost, distance barriers, or their own hesitation to take that first step. They'll be able to start participating in a therapeutic process. I didn't bring statistics. I'm sure you guys have probably heard about the percent of mental illness problems in our culture. But it's legion, and as we're getting better at dealing with disease and the physical aspects of aging and so on, the cognitive, the behavioral, especially in a stress-involved world, start becoming more and more large. So the technology that's here is just coming out in time. I think it's going to be really important, especially in a telemedicine manner, to get out there to help people. So, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, let me... I'll skip forward a little bit. We also use virtual environments for what I described before, for what we call refusal skill training, practicing saying no. So we have virtual environments for somebody comes up and asks you for your drink order, or you go into a liquor store. We have for a clinician to induce a craving for someone who has an addiction problem is a big challenge, because you can't exactly show them marijuana. You can't exactly show them cocaine in a therapeutic environment. It's illegal. Yet you need, in order to get them to master their cravings, you need to stimulate that response. So we can do it very effectively with virtual cues. Again, the telemedicine model makes a big difference. One of the things I'm really excited about is behavioral medicine is really devoid of a lot of objective data. It's a very subjective world right now with very subjective measurement scales that are often just collected in an analog manner. Data piles up in files, but it's never, algorithms aren't optimized. By using a virtual environment in a telemedicine manner, we can start collecting and anonymatizing data at the back end to start refining protocols. And this is really important.
The little thing in front of the laptop is a Kinect, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's an early version of a Kinect. Yeah, and the snowman, well, who knows where that came from. Actually, this is an illustration I did 20 years ago.
Oh, really?
It's just now coming out.
Cool.
But this is a really important thing. And here's something else I wanted to talk about. The tools that clinicians have right now in behavioral medicine for measuring psychological state are really limited. You guys, you may not have taken some of these tests like you probably have taken an intelligence test. I'm sure the people in this room have. But some of the psychological inventories like the MMPI test, etc., very old. The answers are out there on the internet. So if you, in some ways, if you're using them to screen for employee issues, etc., the answers can be found and people can break the system. So there's a need to come up with some better ways of measuring mental status, mental state that are ecologically correct and are variable. So what I want to do is use virtual environments as a better way of doing psychological assessment. Instead of a subjective assessment, to have some trials. We have somebody be challenged. Maybe we have them, if we're looking for an attention issue with attention deficit disorder, well, we have them go for a virtual bicycle ride and a bunch of distractions come up. And how you respond to those distractions, how long you attend to them, how quick you can get back on task. But do it in a functional manner rather than the silly tests that we're doing right now. For more complex cognition, executive functions, same thing. As we age, we're going to want to have, there's going to be more therapeutic options out there. But unless we have the underlying data to optimize the protocols, refine the drug and therapeutic interventions, we're not going to be able to refine the response. So this stuff is really important in terms of improving the next generation of behavioral health care because we'll finally have data that we haven't had before. Okay. Push on a bit. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about there's a business model behind this. We can show how it increases revenue, how it reduces cost, how there's a number of value points for like state and local governments. I think I remember reading recently that the state of New Jersey spent $2.5 billion on mental health care services alone in 1 year. That mental health care and some of the subsidiary problems like violence and addictions and so on is extremely expensive. And so the state and local governments have an interest in this. They're already spending a lot of money on not very effective therapeutic programs, such as prisons. But patients themselves have an interest because it's less boring, there's better results, reduced stigma. There's a business model for the clinicians and the practice owners. So later, if you guys have questions about the business model behind this, I can go into that in detail too. Okay, another example of where you're using virtual environments. This is a very beautiful game environment that my group created that we're using for kids who are going through painful procedures like recovering from burns or having a bone set, etc. So we create an engaging environment that's specifically designed to distract them during a painful procedure. It's just sort of a modest example of how this technology can be applied to a particular problem, but it's one that's finally getting out there. And it's nice to have the graphical tools to finally be able to do this. In this case, we have a controlled breathing that goes along with the distraction. And in order to progress through the virtual environment, you have to regulate your breathing. And that helps distract them from the pain. We're also using virtual environments for stress inoculation. This is a project we're doing with the Center for Disease Control to help them train first responders how to deal with going into an earthquake zone. I'd also like to use the same environment for the post-traumatic stress from earthquakes. As you guys know, there's Haiti, there's China, there's Japan with the tsunami. there's a huge amount of post-traumatic stress that will go untreated unless we can come up with a cost-effective way to do it. So again, we use the virtual environments, and with the same paradigm that I showed you before, we do the therapeutic process. But you can also prepare people who are likely to go through a distressful process by having them go through it in a virtual environment and be prepared cognitively for it. It helps reduce the risk of post-traumatic stress. Here's another interesting application. This is training a clinician on how to present a terminal diagnosis. You'd be surprised at, and Eric, maybe you remember this from your medical training, you'd be surprised at how ill-prepared clinicians can be for delivering bad news. And if they don't deliver it very well, it can be a horrible experience for the patient. Can make what otherwise could be a manageable issue become very difficult to manage if the presentation of the problem is not handled well. So that we're working with MD Anderson Clinic we've developed this system here for the clinicians to practice how to deal, sort of like a flight simulator, but flight simulator for delivering a terminal diagnosis. In this case, we're using a green screened
Oh, hi,
avatar.
it's nice to meet you.